She sent text messages saying she'd run away. Her family searched 2 cities trying to find her. Police followed every digital breadcrumb across the English countryside, but Jenny Nicholl never sent those messages, and she was already dead when they arrived. This is the story of how a professor analyzing spelling mistakes solved a murder, how a jealous predator thought he could hide behind a phone screen, and how one family's fight for justice changed British law forever. Welcome to Crime Unknown. I'm your host, and today we're investigating the Jenny Nicholl case, a pioneering murder conviction secured without a body, built on groundbreaking forensic linguistics, hidden woodland huts, and the relentless determination of parents who refused to let their daughter be forgotten. To understand what was taken from the Nicholl family on the 30th of June, 2005, you need to know who Jenny was. Not just a missing persons description, not just a case number, but a 19-year-old woman with dreams, routines, passions, and people who loved her deeply. Jennifer Nicholl, known to her family as Are We Jen, lived with her parents on Bolton Avenue in Richmond, a historic market town in North Yorkshire. Richmond sits in the northern reaches of Yorkshire, a place where limestone buildings line cobbled streets, where the ruins of an 1100-year-old castle overlook the River Swale, and where everyone seems to know everyone else's business. Her father, Brian Nicholl, was a retired Army major. Military service had taken the family to various postings throughout Jenny's childhood, but they'd eventually settled in Richmond, following Jenny's eldest brother, who was stationed at Catterick Garrison, one of the largest British Army bases in the country, located just a few miles south of the town. Her mother, Anne, sometimes spelled Anne in various reports, maintained what would become crucially important in this case: close, constant contact with her daughter. This wasn't a family where days could pass without communication. Jenny checked in. She told her parents where she was going. She maintained predictable patterns of behavior that would make her disappearance all the more alarming when those patterns suddenly shattered. Jenny stood approximately 5 feet 6 inches tall with fair, shoulder-length hair that she often wore pulled back in a ponytail. But it was her eyes that people remembered most, distinctive green eyes that would become a focal point of missing person appeals broadcast across the nation. Music coursed through Jenny's life like a second heartbeat. She was a devoted Jimi Hendrix fan, that legendary guitarist whose innovative style revolutionized rock music in the late 1960s. Jenny didn't just listen to Hendrix, she emulated him. She played guitar in a local rock band called No Fouling, a group that performed at Richmond Live Music Festival and various pubs around town. For anyone who's ever been in a local music scene, you understand what this means. These weren't international stages or recording contracts. These were sticky-floored pubs where the PA system sometimes cut out mid-song, where your biggest fans were friends and family in the front row, where you loaded your own equipment and split 20 pounds 5 ways at the end of the night. But it was real. It was hers. It was a community and an identity and a future that was taking shape one chord progression at a time. By day, Jenny worked as a shop assistant at the co-op store in Richmond, steady employment that provided structure and independence. The co-op, for those unfamiliar with British retail, is a cooperative supermarket chain with stores throughout the United Kingdom. It's the kind of local employer where you'd see the same customers weekly, where you'd chat about the weather while scanning groceries, where you'd become part of the fabric of your community. Jenny treasured certain possessions with the fierce attachment that meaningful objects inspire. There was an aluminum jewelry box where she kept her small valuables, a silver Goodman CD/radio/cassette player, the kind of all-in-one device that was standard technology in 2005, before smartphones turned every device into a music player. And then there was the teddy bear. This wasn't just any stuffed animal. This was a military-dressed teddy bear she'd received as a Christmas gift when she was 6 years old. Think about that for a moment. She was now 19 and she still kept this childhood bear, carried it with her, treasured it as a connection to her family and her father's military service. This bear, dressed in miniature military uniform, represented her whole childhood, her family's identity, her father's career. Remember that bear. It will become crucial evidence in ways that will break your heart. This was Jenny Nicholl in the spring and early summer of 2005, 19 years old, living with her parents, working at the local co-op, playing guitar in a rock band, maintaining close family ties, following predictable routines. A young woman in that transitional space between adolescence and full adulthood, still rooted in family while beginning to spread independent wings. But there was something else in Jenny's life, something her parents didn't fully know about, something that had been growing in the shadows for 5 years since she was just 14 years old. Someone was watching Jenny, someone who thought he owned her, someone whose jealousy would ultimately turn murderous. David Hodgson first encountered Jenny Nicholl when she was 14 years old. Let that sink in. 14. A child by any legal and moral standard, a ninth grader, someone who should have been worrying about homework and first crushes and which band to listen to, not catching the attention of a grown man. Hodgson was 40 years old when he met 14-year-old Jenny. He had a wife. He had children, specifically 2 daughters who attended St. Francis Xavier School in Richmond, the same school Jenny attended. That's how he gained access to her. He befriended his daughter's school friend. He inserted himself into her life through a connection that should have been safe, that should have been innocent. What began as friendship, at least from Jenny's naive 14-year-old perspective, evolved into what prosecutors would later describe as a possessive and controlling relationship characterized by intense jealousy and rage. By the time Jenny disappeared in 2005, David Hodgson was 45 years old, 26 years older than Jenny, more than twice her age. A married father exploiting a teenager he'd been grooming since she was barely out of childhood. Hodgson was unemployed, though he occasionally did gardening work, but his primary occupation appears to have been building secret meeting places in the woods and controlling Jenny Nicholl. Let me describe these woodland locations because they're central to understanding how Hodgson operated and how this crime was eventually solved. Between Richmond and Catterick Garrison lies an area called Sandbeck Plantation, wooded land near the A6136 road. This wasn't deep wilderness. This was accessible woodland near a major road and a massive military base, but it was secluded enough for privacy, hidden enough for secrets. In these woods, Hodgson constructed ramshackle wooden huts. According to his own statements, these were supposedly meeting places for card games and drinking with friends, innocent social spaces. But the reality was far darker. These huts became secret locations where Hodgson met Jenny away from public view, away from her family, away from anyone who might question what a man in his 40s was doing with a teenage girl. DNA evidence recovered from foam mattresses in these huts would later confirm sexual activity between Hodgson and Jenny. The forensic science was unambiguous. Whatever lies Hodgson would tell, whatever denials he would make, his genetic material told the truth. Multiple witnesses would testify to Hodgson's temperament. He would explode into jealous rages if he saw Jenny with other men. Court testimony painted a picture of a man who viewed Jenny not as an autonomous person with her own life and choices, but as a possession to be controlled, monitored, and isolated. This possessive jealousy is a bright red warning sign for domestic violence and homicide. When someone believes they own another person, when they fly into rage at the thought of that person's independence, when they systematically isolate their victim from family and normal social connections, these are textbook precursors to violence. Jenny had known Hodgson since she was 14. By 19, she'd been under his influence for 5 years, more than a quarter of her entire life. That's not a relationship. That's grooming. That's predation. That's a grown man exploiting the developmental vulnerability of a child and then a teenager, shaping her understanding of what was normal, acceptable, or loving. But something changed in the weeks before June 30th, 2005. Jenny had begun seeing someone new, not just anyone. She'd begun a relationship with Robert Hodgson, David's own brother. Think about the psychology here. David Hodgson had been secretly controlling Jenny for 5 years. He'd built hidden huts to meet her away from public scrutiny. He'd maintained this secret possession of a woman young enough to be his daughter, and now his own brother was dating her, openly, legitimately, without the secrecy and control that David required. Prosecutors would argue this development triggered murderous jealousy. The prosecution characterized Hodgson as an intensely jealous man who killed Jenny because he was angry about Nicholl's new relationship with his brother. This theory makes psychological sense. David hadn't just lost control over Jenny, he'd been replaced by his own brother, someone from his own family, someone who represented everything David wasn't: younger, unmarried, able to date Jenny publicly without scandal. The narcissistic wound this would inflict on a controlling, possessive man cannot be overstated. Jenny had no idea she was dating herself into a death sentence. She was 19 years old, probably feeling adult and independent for the first time, perhaps finally breaking free from David's controlling influence, maybe thinking she could move forward with someone closer to her own life stage. She had no idea the predator in the woodland was planning her murder. Thursday, June 30th, 2005 began as an ordinary summer day in Richmond, North Yorkshire. Jenny Nicholl went about her normal routines. She worked her shift at the co-op. She came home to Bolton Avenue. And at approximately 6 o'clock in the evening, she told her mother she was meeting friends and would not be returning home that night. This wasn't unusual. Jenny was 19. She sometimes stayed with friends. She went camping. She had a social life that extended beyond her parents' home. What was crucial, and what would later make her disappearance so obviously suspicious, was that Jenny always informed her family of her whereabouts. She maintained contact. She checked in. When Jenny left home that evening, she took camping equipment with her. She took her Silver Goodman CD radio cassette player, and she departed in her White Rover 214i, a small British-made car that would soon become a crucial piece of missing person appeals. That was the last confirmed sighting of Jenny Nicholl alive. We don't know exactly what happened over the next hours. We can only reconstruct the timeline from the shadows, from what wasn't said, from who didn't call, from the absence that would soon become deafening. 4 days passed. Friday, July 1st, no contact from Jenny. Saturday, July 2nd, silence. Sunday, July 3rd. Nothing. For a family like the Nicholls, where communication was routine, where Jenny checked in, where patterns were predictable, 4 days of silence was catastrophic. This wasn't a daughter being forgetful or a young woman enjoying freedom. This was wrong. On Monday, July 4th, 2005, after 4 days without any contact from their daughter, Brian and Ann Nicholl reported Jenny missing to North Yorkshire Police. That same day, police located Jenny's White Rover 214 UC. It was abandoned in the car park of the Holly Hill Inn on Richmond's outskirts. The pub sits on the edge of town, a location that's simultaneously public and peripheral, visible enough to be found, remote enough to be left for days without immediate notice. The car's discovery transformed this from a missing person inquiry into something more sinister. Jenny hadn't driven away and kept going. Her vehicle was right here, in Richmond, abandoned. Where was she? North Yorkshire Police moved quickly. A dedicated incident room was established at Richmond Police Station, staffed by approximately 20 officers. This wasn't a casual response. This was a major investigation mobilizing significant resources. In a force that covers 3,800 square miles of northern England, dedicating 20 officers to a single case indicated how seriously police took Jenny's disappearance. Detective Inspector Pete Martin took the lead on the investigation. His name will recur throughout this case. He would become the public face of the search for Jenny Nicholl, the officer who would eventually shepherd this case from missing person to murder inquiry to conviction. In those early days of July 2005, police followed standard missing person protocols. They interviewed Jenny's family, friends, co-workers. They examined her routine, where she worked, where she socialized, who she knew. They checked hospitals and police stations. They issued appeals for information. They tried to understand where a predictable, family-oriented 19-year-old woman could have gone without telling anyone. And then, on July 9th, something happened that gave Jenny's family desperate hope but would later prove to be the first crack in the killer's alibi. Jenny's phone sent a text message. On Saturday, July 9th, 2005, 9 days after Jenny was last seen, her mobile phone transmitted a text message from Brampton near Carlisle. For those unfamiliar with Northern England geography, let me orient you. Richmond sits in North Yorkshire. Carlisle is approximately 60 miles northwest, across the border in Cumbria. Brampton is a small town just east of Carlisle, about 2 miles from the city center. This was a significant distance from where Jenny disappeared, suggesting she'd traveled, suggesting she was alive, suggesting there was hope. The message claimed Jenny had run away and was heading to Scotland. For parents who'd been living in agonizing uncertainty for 9 days, this must have felt like resurrection. She's alive, she's communicating, she's somewhere, we can find her. Anne Nicholl traveled to Brampton and Carlisle, searching for her daughter. Imagine that journey, a mother driving 60 miles to a town she doesn't know, carrying hope and desperation in equal measure, looking for a 19-year-old woman who could be anywhere in a city of 70,000 people. Walking streets, checking faces, probably carrying photos, certainly asking questions. Have you seen this girl? Green eyes, shoulder-length fair hair, plays guitar? Finding no one. Then on Thursday, July 14, 2005, 14 days after Jenny's disappearance, another text arrived from Jenny's phone. This one was sent from Jedburgh in the Scottish borders. Again, let me orient you geographically. Jedburgh sits about 45 miles north of Carlisle, well across the Scottish border in the region known as the Scottish Borders. It's a historic town of about 4,000 people, known for its ruined abbey and its place in centuries of border conflicts between England and Scotland. The progression seemed to make narrative sense. Brampton near Carlisle on July 9th, Jedburgh in Scotland on July 14th. A path moving northward, a trail to follow, evidence she was alive and moving. The July 14th message to her father read, "I do you ate me, I know Mum does. I ain't cumin' back and the pigs won't find me. Everyone hates me and rich." Let me translate this text speak for clarity. Why do you hate me? I know Mum does. I ain't coming back and the pigs won't find me. Everyone hates me in Richmond. For parents reading this message, the content must have been heartbreaking. Your daughter thinks you hate her. She's calling police pigs with teenager contempt. She's saying everyone in Richmond hates her. She's saying she's not coming back. But there's also something to hold on to. She's alive, she's communicating, and where there's communication, there's the possibility of resolution, of bringing her home, of fixing whatever went wrong. Anne Nicholl made another journey, this time to Jedburgh, Scotland, another search through an unfamiliar town, another series of conversations with locals, shopkeepers, police, another round of asking, "Have you seen my daughter?" Another return home with no answers. But North Yorkshire police were already beginning to question these messages. Something wasn't right. On Wednesday, July 13th, the day before the Jedburgh text arrived, police interviewed David Hodgson for the first time. Hodgson denied any relationship with Jenny. He denied involvement in her disappearance. He presented himself as merely the father of one of Jenny's school friends, a peripheral figure with no relevant information. This was the first of many lies. In late July 2005, police found Hodgson in one of his woodland huts near Hudswell, a village about 2 miles northwest of Richmond. He was suffering from hypothermia. He'd apparently taken an overdose of pills and wine. Whether a genuine suicide attempt or a performance of despair, we cannot know. In subsequent interviews after this incident, Hodgson changed his story. He now admitted having a relationship with Jenny. But he claimed it had ended 12 months earlier, a full year before her disappearance. He was acknowledging the relationship to explain away evidence police might find, while simultaneously distancing himself from her current life and disappearance. This was the second lie. The relationship hadn't ended 12 months earlier. It was ongoing. Witnesses would testify to seeing them together. The DNA evidence from his woodland huts would tell a different story. Meanwhile, the investigation was grinding through that terrible limbo that families of missing persons know too well. Days becoming weeks, becoming months. Searches finding nothing. Appeals yielding no confirmed sightings. Financial records showing no activity. Jenny's bank accounts hadn't been touched since June 28th, 2 days before she disappeared. By autumn 2005, the awful conclusion was becoming inescapable. On Thursday, November 3rd, 2005, 4 months and 4 days after Jenny was last seen, Detective Inspector Pete Martin announced that the investigation had become a murder inquiry. He stated it was extremely unlikely Jenny was alive. Her complete absence from financial systems, her total cessation of contact with family beyond those two suspicious texts, the abandoned car, the broken patterns, all evidence pointed toward the same grim reality. Jenny Nicholl was dead. The question was, who killed her and where was her body? On Tuesday, December 13th, 2005, more than 5 months after Jenny disappeared, her mother, Ann Nicholl, appeared on BBC Crime Watch, the long-running television program that reconstructs unsolved crimes and appeals for public information. Crime Watch has been a fixture of British television since 1984. The format is straightforward. Police present cases, reconstructions dramatize crimes, family members make direct appeals, and viewers call in with information. For families of missing persons and murder victims, Crime Watch represents both hope and horror, the hope that someone watching knows something, the horror of your worst moment being broadcast to millions. During her appearance, Anne held up a replica of Jenny's military-dress teddy bear, that childhood Christmas gift, that treasured possession, that connection to family and innocence. "Please," she essentially said to the nation, "if you've seen this bear, if you know where my daughter is, if you have any information, come forward." The bear was distinctive. Military uniform on a stuffed animal isn't common. If someone had seen it, if it had been discarded somewhere, if it was in a pawn shop or charity shop or someone's possession, maybe a viewer would remember it. What Ann Nicholl didn't know, what none of the family knew yet, was that the actual teddy bear was approximately 5 miles away from where she was making that appeal, hidden in woodland, concealed where David Hodgson had left it, waiting to be discovered. The breakthrough came months later, on Monday, March 20th, 2006. Police were conducting searches at Sandbeck Plantation, the wooded area between Richmond and Catterick Garrison where Hodgson had built his ramshackle huts. They found Jenny's teddy bear. They found her silver Goodman CD radio cassette player. These items weren't lying in plain sight. They were concealed in woodland, hidden deliberately, tucked away where Hodgson had placed them after Jenny's murder. Her parents also found her nightdress and cosmetics buried under leaves during searches in the area. Ann Nicholl wept in court later recalling this moment, finding her daughter's nightdress hidden under forest debris, understanding what this meant, confronting the physical reality of Jenny's death through scattered belongings in woodland. Think about what these items represent, evidentially. These were Jenny's personal possessions, things she'd brought with her on June 30th, things that should have been with her wherever she went. The fact they were hidden in Hodgson's woodland meeting places was damning. Why would Jenny's teddy bear and CD player be concealed in woods associated with David Hodgson if she'd run away to Scotland as the text claimed? Why would her nightdress and cosmetics be buried under leaves if she'd left voluntarily? Why would these items be here at all unless something terrible happened in this location? The net was tightening around David Hodgson. Police now had means. Hodgson's jealousy over Jenny's new relationship with his brother. They had opportunity. Jenny had been to his woodland locations. The DNA proved that. They had Jenny's possessions hidden in his territory, and they were about to uncover evidence that would prove Hodgson had fabricated those text messages to make police believe Jenny had run away. The text message analysis would crack this case wide open. But it would take a pioneer in a field most people had never heard of to prove what detectives suspected. Enter Professor Malcolm Coulthard and the emerging science of forensic linguistics. To understand how Professor Malcolm Coulthard's analysis proved David Hodgson sent those text messages, I need to first explain what forensic linguistics is and why it matters in criminal investigations. Forensic linguistics is the application of linguistic knowledge, methods, and insights to forensic contexts. Essentially, it's using the scientific study of language to answer legal questions. This can include analyzing threatening letters, determining authorship of disputed documents, examining trademark infringement, or, as in this case, determining who wrote text messages. The fundamental insight of forensic linguistics is this: we all have linguistic fingerprints. Just as your actual fingerprints are unique, so too are the subtle patterns of how you use language. Word choice, grammar structures, spelling habits, punctuation patterns, use of abbreviations. These create an individual profile that's remarkably consistent and surprisingly difficult to disguise. Professor Malcolm Coulthard was, and is, a pioneer in this field. Based at Aston University's Center for Forensic Linguistics in Birmingham, Coulthard has provided expert linguistic analysis in numerous criminal cases. By 2005, when Jenny Nicholl disappeared, Coulthard had already established himself as Britain's leading forensic linguist. When North Yorkshire police recovered Jenny's phone records and examined those suspicious text messages from Brampton and Jedburgh, they faced a crucial question. Did Jenny actually send these messages, or did someone else? The phone was Jenny's. The messages were sent from her SIM card. But who typed the actual words? This is where Professor Coulthard's analysis became crucial. He was provided with 3 sets of text messages to examine. First, the disputed messages, the text sent from Brampton and Jedburgh claiming Jenny had run away. Second, 11 text messages that were known with certainty to have been written by Jenny Nicholl. These were previous messages sent before her disappearance, recovered from friends' phones, establishing her baseline linguistic style. Third, over 100 text messages sent by David Hodgson, recovered from various recipients' phones, establishing his linguistic profile. Coulthard's task was to determine, do the disputed messages match Jenny's writing style or Hodgson's? He identified 9 distinctive stylistic features that discriminated between the 2 possible authors. Let me walk through each one because together they build an absolutely damning case. Feature number 1, the use of my versus me and myself versus meself. Jenny consistently used standard English forms, my as a possessive pronoun and myself as a reflexive pronoun. For example, she'd write my phone or I did it myself. Hodgson, however, used Yorkshire dialect forms, me as a possessive pronoun and meself as a reflexive pronoun. He'd write me phone or I did it meself. This is a deep dialectical pattern, often established in childhood based on regional speech patterns. Yorkshire dialect commonly uses me where standard English uses my. You'd hear someone say, I'm going to me mum's house, rather than my mum's house. The disputed messages used me and meself, Hodgson's pattern, not Jenny's. Feature number 2, the abbreviation of I am. Jenny abbreviated I am as im, no apostrophe, just the 2 letters together. This is common in rapid text messaging where punctuation feels like extra effort. The disputed texts, however, spelled out I am in full, matching Hodgson's style, which tended toward less abbreviation in this particular construction. This might seem trivial, but think about it. You probably abbreviate certain phrases consistently in your own text messages. I'm versus im versus I am becomes habitual. You don't consciously decide each time, you just type what feels natural, and what feels natural to you is different from what feels natural to someone else. Feature number 3, the spelling of phone. Jenny spelled it phone, a phonetic abbreviation common in text messaging where you save characters and typing effort. The disputed text spelled it phone, the standard spelling that Hodgson used. Again, this might seem minor, but if you're trying to fake someone else's texts, you need to match not just their vocabulary but their habitual shortcuts. Hodgson didn't know Jenny texted phone. He wrote phone because that's what he always wrote. Feature number 4 and 5, characteristic misspellings. The disputed texts contained 2 misspellings that were characteristic of Hodgson's writing, might for might and of for off. These weren't random typos. These were consistent patterns in Hodgson's texts. He regularly confused might and might, probably a phonetic spelling of how the word sounds. He regularly confused of and off, a common error but one that Jenny didn't make in her confirmed texts. Misspellings are particularly valuable for authorship analysis because they're hard to fake and hard to suppress. If you consistently misspell certain words, you'll likely continue doing so even when trying to imitate someone else's writing. Your brain has encoded the wrong spelling and it emerges automatically. Feature number 6. CU abbreviations. Jenny abbreviated CU as Q, a straightforward phonetic reduction. Hodgson abbreviated it as Saya, a different phonetic representation of the same phrase, adding a Y sound. Both are common text abbreviations, but individuals tend to settle on one form and use it consistently. The disputed messages used Siaya, Hodgson's form. Features 7, 8, and 9, additional patterns. Coulthard identified additional discriminating features in the messages, though these 6 examples I've detailed are the most clearly documented in available sources. The totality of patterns created a linguistic fingerprint that overwhelmingly pointed to one author, David Hodgson. Professor Coulthard testified in court that the disputed messages were inconsistent with the described style of Jenny Nicholl and that Hodgson was one of a group of possible authors. Careful, scientifically precise language that acknowledged Hodgson might not be the only person who wrote this way, but that Jenny definitely didn't write this way. But linguistic analysis alone, however compelling, might not have been sufficient for conviction. What transformed this from interesting academic analysis to devastating prosecution evidence was physical corroboration. Remember, those texts were sent from Brampton near Carlisle on July 9th and from Jedburgh in Scotland on July 14th. Police examined David Hodgson's movements on those dates. On July 9th, 2005, David Hodgson hired a car. On July 14th, 2005, David Hodgson hired a car. The distances recorded on those car hire records matched precisely the round-trip journeys from Richmond to Carlisle and from Richmond to Jedburgh, the exact locations from which those texts were sent. Think about what this means. It's not just that someone who wrote like Hodgson sent those texts. It's that Hodgson physically drove to those locations on those exact dates. He hired cars, probably to avoid his own vehicle being tracked, and drove the precise distances necessary to reach Brampton and Jedburgh. Phone records added the final corroboration. Jenny's mobile phone was switched off immediately after each message was sent. Why switch off immediately? Because if the phone remained active, police could track its ongoing movements, could possibly triangulate its location if Hodgson made mistakes. Send message, switch off phone, drive back to Richmond. The actions of someone creating a false trail, not someone actually traveling northward. The linguistic analysis, the car hire records, and the phone behavior created a 3-legged evidentiary stool that was unshakable. Hodgson had faked those messages. He'd driven to Carlisle and Jedburgh to make it appear Jenny was traveling northward into Scotland. He'd crafted a narrative of a troubled young woman running away from family who hated her. And while police were following that false trail, searching Brampton and Jedburgh, while Anne Nicholl was driving to Scotland looking for her daughter, Jenny's body was already hidden somewhere in the Richmond area, and David Hodgson knew exactly where it was. Despite extensive searches, police never found Jenny Nicholl's body. Sandbeck Plantation was searched repeatedly. Surrounding woodlands were combed. Hodgson's other known locations were examined. Nothing. This presented a significant challenge for prosecutors. British law doesn't require a body to prosecute murder. Murder can be proven circumstantially, but juries are understandably reluctant to convict for murder when no body has been found. There's always that nagging doubt. What if she's actually alive somewhere? What if this is all a massive misunderstanding? Prosecutors needed to build a case so overwhelming, so airtight, that no reasonable jury could conclude anyone but David Hodgson killed Jenny Nicholl. In May 2007, nearly 2 years after Jenny's disappearance, Hodgson was formally charged with murder. He appeared at North Allerton Magistrates Court and was remanded in custody, meaning he'd await trial in prison rather than on bail. The trial began on Tuesday, January 15th, 2008, at Teesside Crown Court in Middlesbrough. The Honorable Mr. Justice Openshaw presided. James Goss, QC standing for Queen's Counsel, a senior barrister, led the prosecution. The trial would last 5 weeks. 5 weeks of testimony, evidence, expert witnesses, and legal argument, all building toward one question. Did David Hodgson murder Jenny Nicholl? Let me walk through the key elements of the prosecution's case, the web of circumstantial evidence that piece by piece left no reasonable doubt. Element 1. The relationship and its true nature. Prosecutors established that Hodgson had known Jenny since she was 14 years old, that he'd met her through his daughters who attended the same school. Witnesses testified to seeing them together over the years. This countered Hodgson's initial denial of any relationship and his later claim it had ended a year before her disappearance. The DNA evidence from mattresses in Hodgson's woodland huts proved sexual activity between them. This was damning on multiple levels. First, it proved Hodgson lied about the relationship's nature and timeline. Second, it established these huts as places of intimacy and secrecy. Third, it corroborated witnesses who said Hodgson was possessive and controlling. He'd built hidden locations for secret meetings, away from public view, away from Jenny's family. Element 2. Jealousy and motive. Multiple witnesses testified to Hodgson's jealous temperament. He would explode into jealous rages when seeing Jenny with other men. This established his possessive psychology. Robert Hodgson, David's brother, testified that he'd begun a relationship with Jenny in the weeks before her disappearance. This provided motive. David had been secretly controlling Jenny for years, and now his own brother was dating her openly, legitimately, publicly. For someone whose entire relationship with Jenny was predicated on secrecy and control, this was an intolerable narcissistic wound. Prosecutors argued David Hodgson killed Jenny because he was angry about Nicholl's new relationship with his brother, a crime of jealous rage committed by an intensely jealous man. Element 3. The last known movements. Jenny left home on June 30th with camping equipment. She was familiar with Hodgson's woodland locations. Her possessions, teddy bear, CD player, nightdress, cosmetics, were found hidden at Sandbeck Plantation where Hodgson had built his huts. The logical inference: Jenny went camping with Hodgson at his woodland location on June 30th. Something happened. An argument, a jealous confrontation, a rage that spiraled into violence. Hodgson killed her, disposed of her body, and hid her possessions in the woods. Element 4. The fake texts and cover-up. Professor Coulthard's linguistic analysis proved Hodgson wrote those messages, not Jenny. The car hire records proved he drove to Carlisle and Jedburgh on the dates the messages were sent. The phone records proved Jenny's phone was switched off immediately after each message. This established consciousness of guilt. Hodgson knew he'd killed Jenny, and he constructed an elaborate deception to make police believe she'd run away. He created a false trail to Scotland, wasting police resources and torturing Jenny's family with false hope. Element 5. The pattern of lies. Hodgson's statements to police evolved as evidence mounted against him. First interview: denied any relationship with Jenny, denied involvement in her disappearance. After the apparent overdose, admitted a relationship but claimed it ended 12 months earlier. Faced with DNA evidence, unable to maintain the denial of recent contact. Confronted with car hire records, no credible explanation for driving to Carlisle and Jedburgh. Asked about Jenny's possessions in his woodland, no credible explanation. Each lie, when exposed, damaged his credibility further. By trial, Hodgson's defense was in tatters. Element 6. The absence of any alternative explanation. Jenny was not someone who disappeared without telling anyone. Her financial accounts hadn't been touched since June 28th. She hadn't contacted family, friends, her employer, anyone. Her car was abandoned locally. Her possessions were hidden in Hodgson's territory. If Jenny had voluntarily left, why abandon her car at the Holly Hill Inn? Why not take her treasured teddy bear? Why would her nightdress and cosmetics be buried under leaves in Sandbeck Plantation? Why would she need Hodgson to travel to Carlisle and Jedburgh to send texts? The scenario made no logical sense. The defense attempted various theories. They suggested Jenny was escaping an abusive father, an argument Mr. Justice Openshaw would later dismiss as made without the slightest shred of supporting evidence. They initially had Hodgson's daughter testify that Jenny was seen alive 2 days after her disappearance, staying with Robert Hodgson. But Robert himself denied this under oath, demolishing that alibi. By trial's end, the defense had no coherent alternative narrative. They couldn't explain the possessions. They couldn't explain the texts. They couldn't explain the car hires. They couldn't explain why Hodgson lied repeatedly. All they could do was argue the prosecution hadn't absolutely proven murder, that absence of a body meant absence of certainty. But circumstantial evidence, when sufficiently overwhelming, can prove guilt beyond reasonable doubt. And the prosecution's case was, in the trial, judge's words, entirely overwhelming. After 5 weeks of testimony and legal argument, the case went to the jury. 12 ordinary citizens would now decide, was David Hodgson guilty of murdering Jenny Nicholl? The jury deliberated for approximately 10 hours over 2 days. This is actually a relatively quick deliberation for a murder trial of this complexity. Some juries deliberate for weeks. 10 hours over 2 days suggests the evidence, though circumstantial, was sufficiently clear. On Tuesday, February 19, 2008, 2 years, 7 months, and 20 days after Jenny Nicholl disappeared, the jury returned with their verdict, guilty of murder. David Hodgson displayed no emotion as the verdict was read, no shock, no tears, no protest of innocence, just cold silence. Mr. Justice Openshaw addressed Hodgson before sentencing, "You are a devious liar." He described how Hodgson had constructed an elaborate web of deceit designed to mislead police and Jenny's family. He noted Hodgson showed no remorse whatsoever. The judge sentenced Hodgson to life imprisonment, the mandatory sentence for murder in England and Wales. The critical question was the minimum term. How long must Hodgson serve before becoming eligible for parole? Mr. E. Enders, Justice Openshaw set the minimum term at 18 years. Let me explain what this means. Under English law, a life sentence means life. The offender remains under supervision for their entire existence, even if released. But they don't necessarily remain in prison for life. After serving their minimum term, often called a tariff, they become eligible to apply for parole. The parole board then determines whether they're safe to release. Hodgson's 18-year minimum term meant he couldn't even apply for parole until approximately 2023 to 2024, calculating from his conviction date in 2008, though his actual tariff started from when he was first remanded in custody in May 2007, meaning parole eligibility would come around 2025. But parole eligibility doesn't mean automatic release. It means the opportunity to argue you're no longer dangerous. And there's one factor that would weigh heavily against Hodgson in any parole hearing: his refusal to reveal where he left Jenny's body. On Tuesday, November 24, 2009, nearly a year and a half after Hodgson's conviction, Coroner Jeff Fell held an inquest into Jenny Nicholl's death at Richmond Town Hall. In English law, an inquest is a judicial inquiry to establish the cause of death, held by a coroner. Even though Hodgson had been convicted of murder, the formal cause of death still needed to be legally recorded. Coroner Fell recorded a verdict of unlawful killing, the legal terminology for homicide when someone is killed by the actions of another person. During the inquest, Fell made a direct appeal to Hodgson. Reveal Jenny's location out of humanity. Tell her parents where their daughter is. Allow them to give her a proper burial, end their suffering. Hodgson said nothing. He has never revealed where he left Jenny Nicholl's body, not in 2009, not in the years since. Complete silence. On the 10th anniversary of Jenny's disappearance in June 2015, Detective Chief Inspector Pete Martin, who'd led the investigation from the beginning, gave a statement reflecting on a decade of searching for Jenny. David Hodgson has never admitted his guilt and has refused to reveal where he left Jenny. He has shown not the slightest hint of remorse or humanity towards Jenny's family. He confirmed that North Yorkshire police considered the investigation remains open until Jenny's remains are found. The file hasn't been closed. The search continues, even 15 years later. Think about what Hodgson's silence means for Jenny's parents. They know their daughter is dead. The jury confirmed that. They know who killed her. He's in prison. But they cannot bury their daughter. They cannot visit a grave. They cannot perform the rituals of mourning that humans have practiced for thousands of years. Jenny's body is somewhere within perhaps 20 miles of Richmond, in woodland most likely. Perhaps buried. Perhaps concealed in a location only Hodgson knows. Close enough that he could have returned to it, could have moved it, could have ensured it would never be found. Brian and Ann Nicholl have had to live with this for nearly 20 years now. Their daughter vanished in 2005. She would be 44 years old today if she'd lived. But she didn't live. She was murdered at 19 by a jealous predator who controlled her since she was a child. And that predator holds the final piece of information that would allow Jenny's parents to say goodbye properly. This compounding of grief, murder plus the denial of burial rights, led the Nicholls to become advocates for a change in British law. They joined a campaign that had been building for years, led by another grieving mother whose daughter's killer also refused to reveal where he'd hidden the body. The campaign was called Helen's Law. To understand Helen's Law and why the Nicholl family became advocates for it, I need to tell you about Helen McCourt. Helen McCourt was 22 years old when she was murdered on February 9, 1988, in Billingham, Merseyside. She was walking home from work when she was abducted, killed, and her body hidden by Ian Sims, a local pub landlord who had obsessed over her. Despite no body being found, Sims was convicted of murder in 1989 based on overwhelming forensic evidence. Helen's blood throughout his pub, her jewelry in his possession, her clothing in trash connected to him. The evidence was damning. He was sentenced to life with a minimum term of 16 years, but Sims never admitted guilt and never revealed where he'd hidden Helen's body. In 2004, having served 16 years, he applied for parole. He was denied, partly because his refusal to disclose the body's location suggested he remained dangerous and lacked remorse. He applied again, and again. Each time, Helen's mother, Marie McCourt, had to endure parole hearings, had to argue that releasing her daughter's killer when he wouldn't even reveal where he'd left her body was an additional cruelty. In 2018, the parole board recommended Sims' release. Marie McCourt was devastated. Here was a man who'd murdered her daughter, who'd never shown remorse, who'd never allowed her to bury Helen properly, being rewarded with freedom after 30 years. Marie McCourt had been campaigning since the 1990s for a law that would require the parole board to consider a killer's refusal to disclose a body's location as evidence of ongoing dangerousness. She called it Helen's Law. The campaign gained momentum in the 2010s. Families of other victims whose bodies were never found joined the cause. The Nicholls, facing exactly the same situation with David Hodgson, became active supporters. Politicians began paying attention. In July 2019, the Ministry of Justice announced they would introduce Helen's Law. In March 2020, the Prisoners' Disclosure of Information about Victims. Act 2020 received royal assent, becoming law. Helen's Law came into force on January 4, 2021. Here's what the law does. It places a legal duty on the parole board to consider a prisoner's failure to disclose information about their victim's remains when assessing whether to grant parole. The refusal to disclose can be taken as evidence the prisoner may pose ongoing risk to public safety. Critically, the law doesn't make it impossible to get parole without disclosure. That would potentially violate human rights law around indefinite detention, but it ensures the failure to disclose is formally weighed as a factor against release. When Helen's Law came into force, Ann and Brian Nicholl described it as fantastic news, though bittersweet. Fantastic because it might keep Hodgson imprisoned longer. Bittersweet because they'd rather have their daughter back than have been in a position to need this law. They made clear they would never directly appeal to Hodgson for information about Jenny's location. We will never ask him as we feel it puts us at his mercy and may provide him with some sort of feeling of control. This is a profound insight into the psychology of dealing with murderers who hide bodies. Asking for information puts the victim's family in a supplicant position, begging the killer for mercy, giving him power, allowing him to enjoy their suffering. The Nicholls refused to give Hodgson that satisfaction. They stated, "We know it will rattle him, and we know if he continues this denial, the likelihood is he won't be going anywhere." As I research and write this in late 2025, David Hodgson is approximately 65 years old. His 18-year minimum term meant parole eligibility around 2025. Helen's law is now in effect, and Hodgson continues to refuse to reveal where he left Jenny. The parole board will have to weigh this silence. What does it mean that a man has been imprisoned for 18 years and still refuses this basic act of humanity? Does it suggest he lacks remorse? Does it suggest he remains dangerous? Does it suggest he's the same controlling, possessive, cruel individual who killed a 19-year-old woman because he couldn't bear that she'd chosen someone else? Helen's law gives the parole board legal grounds to say, yes, this silence matters, and it weighs against release. Whether Hodgson remains imprisoned or is eventually released, one thing is certain. Until he reveals where Jenny is, the Nicholl family's suffering continues, and the case file remains open at North Yorkshire Police. The Jenny Nicholl case represents a landmark in British criminal justice for several reasons beyond the personal tragedy. Let me examine these legal and forensic legacies. Landmark 1. Murder conviction without a body. While British law has always permitted murder convictions without bodies, juries are understandably reluctant to convict in such cases. There's psychological comfort in physical evidence, seeing the victim's body, understanding how death occurred, knowing with certainty that death did occur. The Nicholl case demonstrated that circumstantial evidence, when sufficiently overwhelming and carefully presented, can convince a jury beyond reasonable doubt even without a body. The combination of linguistic evidence, car hire records, phone data, DNA evidence, and motive created a web from which there was no escape. This precedent has encouraged prosecutors in subsequent no-body murder cases. If the Jenny Nicholl case could succeed, other cases with strong circumstantial evidence could be prosecuted confidently. Landmark 2. Establishing forensic linguistics as a recognized discipline. In September 2008, 6 months after Hodgson's conviction, the Council for the Registration of Forensic Practitioners formally recognized forensic linguistics as a forensic specialty. This recognition was influenced significantly by Professor Coulthard's work on both the Jenny Nicholl case and another high-profile case involving Stuart Campbell, who was convicted in 2002 of murdering his 15-year-old niece Danielle Jones, whose body was also never found. In that case, Coulthard's analysis of text messages also proved the defendant had fabricated communications to suggest the victim was alive. The formal recognition of forensic linguistics meant standards for practitioners could be established, training programs could be developed, courts could confidently rely on linguistic evidence as scientifically valid. The discipline gained academic and professional legitimacy. Today, forensic linguistics is used in cases worldwide. Text message analysis has become routine in investigations where authorship is disputed. The techniques Coulthard pioneered are now taught in universities and used by law enforcement globally. Landmark 3. Demonstrating the importance of detailed digital forensics. The Nicholl case showed how phone location data, message timing, and SIM card records could corroborate linguistic analysis. The prosecution didn't just prove Hodgson's writing style matched the disputed texts, they proved he was physically in the locations where the texts were sent, at the times they were sent. This integration of linguistic, digital, and physical evidence, the car hire records, created a multi-layered case that was effectively unassailable. Each type of evidence supported the others, leaving no gaps for reasonable doubt to creep through. Modern investigations now routinely combine these approaches. It's not enough to prove someone wrote a message. You need to prove they had the opportunity to send it, that their movements align with when and where it was sent, that their behavior afterwards suggests consciousness of guilt. Landmark 4. Validating the prosecution of grooming cases. While Hodgson wasn't specifically charged with grooming offenses, the relationship began before comprehensive grooming laws existed in their current form. The trial made clear this was grooming: a 40-year-old man befriending a 14-year-old girl, exploiting family connections, building secret meeting places, isolating her from normal social structures. The jury's willingness to convict reflected societal recognition that such relationships are inherently abusive, regardless of whether the victim believes it's consensual. A 14-year-old cannot consent to a relationship with a 40-year-old. The power imbalance is too vast. The exploitation is too fundamental. By centering this grooming in the prosecution narrative, not just as background but as the foundation of understanding Hodgson's possessive jealousy, prosecutors validated that grooming is both morally wrong and legally relevant to understanding subsequent violence. Landmark 5. Advancing victim families' rights through Helen's Law. The Nicholl's advocacy, combined with Marie McCourt's decades of campaigning, ultimately changed British law. Helen's Law represents recognition that families of victims deserve consideration in parole processes, that refusing to disclose a body's location is itself a form of continued cruelty, and that such refusal legitimately suggests ongoing dangerousness. This is a subtle but important shift in how the criminal justice system balances offender rehabilitation against victim and family rights. Previous law focused almost exclusively on whether the offender was safe to release, considering victim impact only peripherally. Helen's Law mandates that victim impact, specifically the ongoing suffering caused by non-disclosure, must be formally weighed. Let me recognize the individuals whose professional dedication secured justice for Jenny Nicholl. Detective Inspector Pete Martin. As the lead investigator, Martin shepherded this case from initial missing person report through murder inquiry to conviction. He maintained public appeals, coordinated searches, developed the forensic strategy that would prove crucial at trial, and has continued to speak about the case on anniversaries. His statement after conviction, calling Hodgson's refusal to disclose Jenny's location an act showing not the slightest hint of remorse or humanity, captured the moral dimension of this case. Professor Malcolm Coulthard. His linguistic analysis provided the breakthrough that transformed suspicion into proof. Coulthard's willingness to testify in court, to explain complex linguistic concepts to a lay jury, and to withstand cross-examination proved crucial. His work on this case and others established forensic linguistics as a legitimate forensic discipline. Beyond this case, Coulthard's academic legacy includes training the next generation of forensic linguists and publishing extensively on language and law. James Goss, QC. As lead prosecutor, Goss had to present an entirely circumstantial case to a jury and convince them beyond reasonable doubt that murder had occurred. The 5-week trial required careful orchestration of multiple types of evidence, forensic, digital, testimonial, woven into a coherent narrative. His success demonstrated that no body murder prosecutions can succeed when evidence is overwhelming. Mr. Justice Openshaw. The trial judge's role included ensuring the trial was fair, that evidence was properly presented, and that the jury understood complex forensic linguistics testimony. His sentencing remarks, calling Hodgson a devious liar who constructed an elaborate web of deceit, reflected judicial recognition of the defendant's callousness. The 18-year minimum term balanced the seriousness of the offense against Hodgson's age and circumstances. The jury. 12 ordinary citizens spent 5 weeks hearing evidence, then deliberated for 10 hours before convicting. They had to understand linguistic analysis, evaluate DNA evidence, interpret phone records, assess witness credibility, and ultimately decide whether circumstantial evidence proved guilt beyond reasonable doubt. Their verdict validated that citizens, properly presented with complex evidence, can make sound judgments in difficult cases. North Yorkshire Police. Beyond Detective Inspector Martin, approximately 20 officers worked the case at various stages. They conducted searches, interviewed witnesses, developed the digital forensics, maintained the incident room, and continued searching for Jenny's body even after conviction. The investigation remains open because Jenny remains missing. Anne and Brian Nicholl. While not professionals in the criminal justice system, Jenny's parents became advocates for legal reform, joined the Helen's Law campaign, endured a lengthy trial where their daughter's intimate life was examined publicly, and maintained dignity throughout their unimaginable suffering. Their refusal to directly ask Hodgson for information to avoid giving him power over them demonstrated remarkable psychological insight. They continue to live without the basic closure that burying their daughter would provide. While we cannot and should not diagnose David Hodgson without proper psychiatric evaluation, we can examine the behavioral patterns that emerge through trial testimony and consider what they tell us about the psychology of such offenders. Pattern 1. Progressive grooming and isolation. Hodgson began grooming Jenny when she was 14. This wasn't opportunistic. He befriended his daughter's school friend, exploited that connection, and gradually drew her into a secret relationship. The woodland huts weren't just meeting places, they were tools of isolation, locations where he controlled the environment and kept Jenny away from normal social structures. Groomers typically work incrementally. They don't immediately reveal predatory intent. They build trust, create dependence, normalize inappropriate behavior gradually. By the time Jenny was 19, she'd spent more than a quarter of her life under Hodgson's influence. Her understanding of what was normal in relationships had been shaped by someone who had exploited her since childhood. Pattern 2. Possessive jealousy and rage. Witnesses testified Hodgson would explode into jealous rages when seeing Jenny with other men. This possessiveness is characteristic of abusers who view partners as property rather than autonomous individuals. Jenny wasn't a person with her own desires and choices. She was something Hodgson owned and controlled. When Jenny began dating Hodgson's brother Robert, this possessive worldview shattered. She'd chosen someone else, she'd demonstrated autonomy, and she'd done so with someone from Hodgson's own family, someone younger, someone who could date her openly, someone who represented everything Hodgson wasn't. For someone whose identity was wrapped up in controlling Jenny, this was intolerable. Murder became a form of reasserting control. If I cannot have you, no one will. Pattern 3. Elaborate deception and impression management. Hodgson's response to Jenny's disappearance wasn't panic or confession, it was calculated deception. He created fake text messages, he drove to multiple locations to send them, making police believe Jenny was traveling to Scotland. He constructed a narrative that Jenny was troubled, running away, rejecting her family. This level of planning suggests someone who prioritizes his own self-preservation above all else. There was no moment of remorse where he thought, I should confess, or I should tell them where she is. Instead, his immediate instinct was, how do I avoid consequences? Pattern 4. Progressive lying under interrogation. Hodgson's statements evolved as evidence mounted. 1. Complete denial of relationship. Admission of relationship but claiming it ended a year ago. 1. Inability to explain DNA evidence, car hires, or Jenny's possessions in his territory. This pattern is common among guilty defendants. They reveal only what they must when confronted with irrefutable evidence, always maintaining the minimum admission necessary. They never voluntarily provide information that might incriminate them. Pattern 5. Complete absence of empathy or remorse. From conviction in 2008 through to the present day, nearly 18 years, Hodgson has never admitted guilt, never shown remorse, and never revealed where he left Jenny's body. This suggests either psychopathic lack of empathy, inability to emotionally understand others' suffering, or narcissistic cruelty. understanding but not caring about others' suffering. Either way, it reflects a profound moral void. Normal humans, even those who've committed terrible crimes, eventually feel some pressure from conscience. They imagine the victim's family suffering. They consider that providing information about the body's location might reduce that suffering. They feel some guilt or remorse or simple human decency that moves them toward disclosure. Hodgson feels none of this, or if he does feel it, he values his continued control over the situation more than he values ending the Nicholl family's torment. Pattern 6. The final assertion of control. By refusing to reveal Jenny's location, Hodgson maintains power over the Nicholls and over Jenny herself. He knows something they desperately want to know. He can grant or withhold this information. He watches them suffer and knows their suffering could end with a single sentence from him. This is the final act of the possessive, controlling relationship that began when Jenny was 14. Even dead, even with him convicted and imprisoned, he still controls her. She cannot be buried without his permission. Her parents cannot mourn properly without his say-so. The Nicholls understand this psychology, which is why they refuse to ask him directly. We will never ask him, as we feel it puts us at his mercy and may provide him with some sort of feeling of control. They've denied him even that small satisfaction. Jenny Nicholl's case exists within a broader category of no-body murder cases, homicides where the victim's remains are never found but conviction is still secured. Historically, such convictions were rare. The legal principle was no body, no murder. Prosecutors feared juries wouldn't convict without physical evidence of death. But over recent decades, advances in forensic science and changing legal attitudes have made no-body convictions more feasible. Some notable British no-body murder cases include Helen McCourt, 1988. As discussed earlier, Ian Sims was convicted based on Helen's blood, clothing, and jewelry found in his possession despite her body never being recovered. This case became the foundation for Helen's Law. Danielle Jones, 2001. 15-year-old Danielle was murdered by her uncle Stuart Campbell. Professor Coulthard's linguistic analysis of text messages proved Campbell had sent fake messages from Danielle's phone. He was convicted in 2002, despite Danielle's body never being found. Joanna Yates, 2010. While Joanna's body was found, the case is notable for another reason. Vincent Tabak was convicted partly based on forensic evidence and suspicious behavior. The case demonstrated evolution in forensic techniques applicable to suspicious disappearances. Georgia Williams, 2013. Jamie Reynolds murdered Georgia and hid her body in Woodland. The body was eventually found, but the case demonstrated how digital evidence, photographs, internet searches, computer files, can prove murder even when bodies are concealed. Alice Gross, 2014. Alice's body was found in the River Brent after she disappeared. The primary suspect, Arnis Zalkalns, died by suicide before prosecution. The case illustrated challenges in stranger abduction murders where suspects die before trial. The common threads in successful no-body prosecutions include 1. Strong circumstantial evidence of foul play, blood evidence, signs of violence, victims' belongings hidden. 1. Digital forensics, proving suspects' movements, communications, and consciousness of guilt. Elimination of alternative explanations. Victim didn't voluntarily disappear, no evidence they're alive. 1. Defendant's lies and inconsistencies, undermining innocent explanations. 1. Expert testimony, explaining specialized evidence, linguistics, DNA, pathology. 1. Clear motive and established relationship between suspect and victim. The Jenny Nicholl case exemplifies all these elements. The prosecution methodically eliminated every innocent explanation, built multiple independent evidence streams that corroborated each other, and presented expert testimony that survived rigorous cross-examination. But no-body cases also highlight a cruel reality. Even when justice is secured through conviction, families remain in limbo. They know their loved one is dead. They know who killed them, but they cannot perform basic human rituals of burial and mourning. This is why Helen's law matters. It recognizes that the criminal justice system shouldn't end at conviction, that ongoing cruelty toward families deserves consideration in parole decisions, and that refusal to disclose a body's location is itself evidence of continued dangerousness. Nearly 20 years after Jenny Nicholl disappeared, North Yorkshire police continue to treat her case as an open investigation. Detective Chief Inspector Pete Martin stated in 2015, "The investigation remains open until Jenny's remains are found." This isn't just procedural language. It means resources remain allocated. It means if new information emerges, it will be pursued. It means Jenny hasn't been forgotten by the institution responsible for finding her. But where do you search after 2 decades? Sandbeck Plantation and surrounding woodlands have been searched repeatedly. Hodgson's known haunts have been examined. Ground-penetrating radar has likely been used in key locations. Cadaver dogs have probably been deployed. Every investigative tool in the modern police arsenal has been applied. The problem is one of scale. The area around Richmond encompasses dozens of square miles of woodland, farmland, moors, and valleys. The Yorkshire Dales stretch endlessly with remote locations where remains could be hidden. Rivers and reservoirs could have been used to dispose of a body. Old mine shafts dot the landscape from centuries of lead mining. Hodgson had time. He had familiarity with the terrain. He had motivation to ensure Jenny would never be found. And he's had 20 years to refine his silence, to commit to never revealing what he knows. Physical evidence degrades over time. Soft tissue would have decomposed within years. Clothing might have rotted. What remains after 2 decades might be skeletal, bones scattered by animal activity, buried under decades of leaf litter, hidden in locations only Hodgson could identify. Some families of missing persons report that the not knowing is worse than the confirmed death. At least death provides certainty, allows grief to proceed through its stages, permits eventually moving forward. But missing presumed dead exists in perpetual limbo. You cannot fully grieve because there's always that impossible hope. You cannot move forward because the central question remains unanswered. The Nicholls live in this limbo. They know Jenny is dead. The jury confirmed it. Hodgson was convicted. But knowledge and certainty are different from closure and peace. Without a grave to visit, without having laid Jenny to rest, without having performed the rituals that humans have used to process death for millennia, how do you achieve closure? Ann Nicholl's appearance on Crime Watch in December 2005, holding that replica teddy bear, appealing for information, that image captures a mother's desperate hope. But by 2008, after conviction, hope transformed into resigned determination. The hope of finding Jenny alive was gone. The hope of finding her body remains. On anniversaries, the 5th, 10th, 15th, 20th, police issue renewed appeals. They ask the public, did you see something around June 30th, 2005? Did you notice Hodgson behaving strangely? Do you remember him mentioning locations he visited? Has he in unguarded prison conversations revealed anything about where Jenny might be? These appeals rarely yield actionable information. Memories fade after 20 years. Witnesses who might have noticed something suspicious in 2005 might not make the connection decades later. People die, move away, forget. And Hodgson says nothing. Several legal questions emerge from the Jenny Nicholl case that continue to resonate in British criminal justice. Question 1. Should refusing to disclose a body's location be a separate criminal offense? Currently, under Helen's law, refusing to disclose a body's location is considered during parole hearings but isn't itself a crime. Some advocates argue it should be a separate offense carrying additional punishment. The argument for concealing a body compounds the original crime, inflicts additional suffering on families, and obstructs justice by preventing proper investigation of death circumstances. The argument against it could violate the privilege against self-incrimination, forcing defendants to provide evidence against themselves, might be difficult to prove. How do you prove someone knows where a body is? And could lead to false confessions if people think claiming to know helps them. British law has generally favored the current approach, considering non-disclosure as an aggravating factor rather than creating a separate offense. Question 2. How much weight should linguistic evidence carry in criminal trials? Hodgson's appeals challenged Professor Coulthard's linguistic analysis, arguing it wasn't scientifically reliable enough to support criminal conviction. The Court of Appeal rejected this challenge, finding linguistic evidence was admissible and reliable when properly presented. But questions remain about how much weight linguistic evidence should carry, especially when it's the primary evidence of guilt. In Jenny's case, linguistic evidence was corroborated by car hire records, phone data, and physical evidence. But what about cases where linguistic analysis is the only evidence? Should that alone be sufficient? Courts generally require linguistic evidence to be based on sufficient comparison texts, using recognized analytical methods, acknowledging limitations and alternative explanations, corroborated by other evidence when possible. The Jenny Nicholl case demonstrated linguistic analysis meeting these standards and surviving appellate scrutiny. Question 3. Should parole be possible for those who refuse to disclose bodies? Helen's law requires the parole board to consider non-disclosure but doesn't prohibit release. Should it? Arguments for prohibition. These offenders demonstrate ongoing cruelty and lack of remorse. They've had years to disclose and refused. Releasing them rewards this behavior and inflicts additional trauma on families. Arguments against indefinite detention without possibility of release potentially violates human rights law. People can be reformed and safe to release even if they don't disclose. Making disclosure mandatory for release creates perverse incentives, false information, supposed inability to remember. The current balance, considering non-disclosure as a very significant factor against release without making it an absolute bar, attempts to navigate these competing concerns. Question 4. What duty of care do police owe to families in long-term missing person cases? North Yorkshire police have maintained communication with the Nicholls, issued regular updates, kept the investigation open, and continued searches. But not all police forces maintain the same level of engagement in cold cases. Should there be mandated minimum contact frequency? Should families have the right to regular briefings? Should police be required to justify why investigations are downgraded or closed? The UK's Missing Persons Bureau and various family advocacy organizations have pushed for clearer standards, but practices vary significantly between police forces. Question 5. Should no-body murder prosecutions have different evidentiary standards? Currently, the legal standard for conviction is the same whether a body is found or not, proof beyond reasonable doubt. But should prosecutors be required to meet a higher threshold when there's no body? Arguments for higher threshold. Without a body, you cannot definitively prove death occurred, cannot establish cause of death, cannot eliminate alternative explanations as thoroughly. Arguments against higher threshold would create perverse incentives for killers to hide bodies effectively, would deny justice to families, isn't necessary if circumstantial evidence is truly overwhelming. British law has maintained the same standard, reasoning that requiring a higher threshold would effectively grant immunity to killers skilled at hiding bodies. Richmond, North Yorkshire is a town of approximately 8,600 people as of recent census data. It's the kind of place where a teenager working at the co-op would be recognized by regular customers, where a local rock band playing at pubs would draw crowds of friends and familiar faces, where a family like the Nicholls would be known throughout the community. When Jenny disappeared in 2005, it sent shockwaves through the town. Missing person posters appeared in shop windows. Local media covered the case extensively. The community organized searches, volunteers combing woodland and checking out buildings. As the case progressed from missing person to murder inquiry to trial, Richmond confronted the reality that someone in their community, David Hodgson, a local man with family in the area, had groomed and murdered a teenager. Small towns often struggle with this cognitive dissonance. Things like this don't happen here is a common refrain, but they do happen everywhere. Predators exist in small Yorkshire market towns just as they exist in major cities. The difference is that in small communities, the impact ripples through everyone. Hodgson's daughters attended school with Jenny. His extended family lived locally. People knew both the victim and the killer. The trial was held in Middlesbrough at Teesside Crown Court, but many Richmond residents attended, including supporters of both the Nicholl family and presumably Hodgson's family. Court proceedings became community events where neighbors were forced to choose sides or maintain awkward neutrality. Local pubs where No Fouling had performed, where Jenny had played guitar and been part of the music scene, became impromptu memorials. Musicians dedicated performances to her memory. The Richmond Live Music Festival, where Jenny's band had played, acknowledged her absence. The co-op store where Jenny worked undoubtedly had memorial gatherings. Co-workers who'd chatted with her daily, who'd worked alongside her, who'd planned futures that included her presence, they grieved the loss and the horror of how it happened. Brian Nicholl, as a retired Army major, had likely been active in Richmond's military veterans community, given the town's proximity to Catterick Garrison. That community would have rallied around the family, provided support, attended court proceedings. But there's another dimension to community impact, the Hodgson family's experience. David had a wife, daughters, extended family. They lived in Richmond, too. They faced community judgment, suspicion, ostracism. His daughters had been Jenny's school friends. How did they process that their father had groomed and murdered their friend? How did they continue living in Richmond where everyone knew their family connection to the case? Some families in this situation leave their communities, unable to bear the weight of association with a killer. Others stay, attempt to rebuild lives, maintain that they're not responsible for their relatives' crimes. Either path is agonizing. The case also impacted local schools. St. Francis Xavier School, where Jenny and Hodgson's daughters attended, had to address with students how someone's parent had committed such a crime. Teachers had to navigate talking about a case involving one of their former students and current student's father. 20 years later, Jenny Nicholl remains part of Richmond's collective memory. New residents learn the story. Longtime residents remember. And the Nicholl family, if they still live in Richmond, navigate a town filled with memories of their daughter. The Jenny Nicholl investigation utilized cutting-edge forensic techniques for 2005, but in the 20 years since, forensic science has advanced dramatically. If this crime occurred today, what additional tools might be available? Advancement. 1. Enhanced phone forensics. In 2005, investigators could determine when and where texts were sent, but phone forensics was relatively limited. Modern smartphones contain vastly more data: GPS location histories, app usage, deleted messages recoverable through advanced techniques, cloud backups, encrypted communications, biometric access logs. If Jenny had a modern smartphone in 2005, investigators might have recovered detailed location data showing her last movements, deleted text conversations with Hodgson, photos with embedded location metadata, app usage patterns showing when her phone was last actively used by her versus by someone else, cloud backups of data. Even if the physical phone was destroyed, the linguistic analysis would still be crucial but would be supplemented by richer digital evidence. Advancement. 2. DNA phenotyping and genealogy. The DNA evidence from Hodgson's huts proved sexual activity between him and Jenny, which was important for establishing their relationship. But modern DNA techniques go further. DNA phenotyping can predict physical characteristics, hair color, eye color, skin tone, facial structure, from biological samples. This helps identify unknown suspects or victims. Forensic genetic genealogy, made famous by the Golden State Killer case, uses DNA uploaded to genealogy databases to identify suspects through distant relatives. While not directly applicable to the Nicholl case, since Hodgson was identified through traditional investigation, such techniques are now standard in many cold cases. Advancement. 3. Digital image and video analysis. Modern investigations routinely examine CCTV footage using facial recognition, gait analysis, and vehicle recognition software. In 2005, CCTV existed, but analysis was largely manual. Investigators watched hours of footage looking for Jenny's car. Today, automated systems could scan footage from the Holly Hill Inn area, Richmond Town Center, and routes towards Sandbeck Plantation, identifying Jenny's vehicle, Hodgson's movements, and timeline reconstruction with greater precision. Advancement 4. Social media forensics. In 2005, social media was in its infancy. Facebook had launched in 2004 but was limited to U.S. college students. MySpace existed but wasn't ubiquitous. Twitter didn't exist yet. If this crime occurred today, Jenny would likely have Instagram, Facebook, Snapchat, TikTok accounts. Her social media activity, or sudden cessation of it, would provide crucial timeline evidence. Her online connections might reveal the relationship with Hodgson. Her posts might document their meetings or her growing concern about his behavior. Hodgson's social media would also be examined. Was he monitoring Jenny's accounts? Was he posting during the period he claimed to be uninvolved with her? Did his digital behavior change after June 30th? Advancement. 5. Improved ground-penetrating radar and search technology. Ground-penetrating radar existed in 2005 but has become more sophisticated, with better resolution and deeper penetration. Cadaver dogs remain crucial but are now supplemented by drones with thermal imaging, LiDAR scanning of woodland terrain, and advanced soil analysis detecting decomposition chemicals. These technologies might help locate Jenny's remains even 20 years later, though time and environmental factors have likely degraded remains significantly. Advancement. C is Advanced Linguistic Corpus Analysis. Professor Coulthard's analysis in 2005 was conducted manually, reading texts, identifying patterns, comparing features. Modern computational linguistics can analyze thousands of texts instantly, identifying probabilistic authorship with statistical confidence levels. Tools like stylometry software can compare disputed texts against known author samples across dozens of variables, generating likelihood ratios for authorship. While human expert testimony remains valuable, computational tools provide additional rigor and can process far larger text samples. Advancement. 7. Cell tower analysis and phone tracking. In 2005, cell tower data could show roughly where a phone was when making calls or sending texts. Modern cell data is far more precise, with triangulation from multiple towers, historical location accuracy, and integration with GPS data. Investigators today could track Hodgson's phone throughout June 30th and beyond, mapping his movements in detail, proving where he was when Jenny disappeared, showing his trips to Carlisle and Jedburgh, revealing patterns of behavior. Despite these advances, the core challenge remains. David Hodgson knows where Jenny is, and he's not telling. No technology can extract that information from an unwilling mind. Jenny Nicholl's murder resulted from a predatory relationship that began when she was 14 and ended with her death at 19. What lessons can we draw to prevent similar tragedies? Lesson 1. Recognize grooming warning signs. Adults befriending children or teenagers outside normal contexts, not teachers, coaches, or family friends with appropriate relationships, should trigger attention. Hodgson befriended his daughter's school friend, a connection that provided access while appearing innocent. Warning signs include adult showing unusual interest in a child, teenager, adult creating opportunities for private time, adult giving gifts or special treatment, adult encouraging secrecy from family, adult isolating young person from peer relationships, relationship involving hidden meetings or communications. Parents, our teachers and friends should be educated to recognize these patterns and intervene early. Lesson 2. Build open communication between parents and children. The Nicholl family maintained close contact with Jenny. She typically informed them of her whereabouts and checked in regularly. This pattern made her disappearance obviously suspicious immediately, but the relationship with Hodgson was kept secret, suggesting Jenny felt she couldn't tell her parents about it. Whether from embarrassment, fear of judgment, or Hodgson's manipulation convincing her to keep it secret, she didn't confide in them. Families should cultivate environments where children and teenagers feel safe discussing relationships, even complicated or inappropriate ones, without fear of punishment or judgment. The goal isn't to stop teenagers from having relationships, but to ensure they'll tell you when something feels wrong. Lesson 3. Address age gap relationships directly. A 40-year-old man with a 14-year-old girl isn't a relationship, it's abuse. Society has become more aware of this in recent years, but cultural messaging still sometimes romanticizes age gap relationships or treats teenage girls as more mature than they are. Schools should educate teenagers about healthy relationship characteristics, including that large age gaps during adolescence represent power imbalances, not sophistication or maturity. Teens should understand that adults who pursue them are engaging in predatory behavior, not offering compliments or recognition of maturity. Lesson 4. Take jealous and controlling behaviors seriously. Witnesses testified Hodgson would explode into jealous rages when seeing Jenny with other men. This possessive jealousy is a major warning sign for domestic violence and homicide. People experiencing jealous or controlling partner behavior should be educated that it's not romantic, it's dangerous. It typically escalates over time. Leaving can be the most dangerous period. Support services exist to help friends and family witnessing controlling relationships should intervene, recognizing that intense love or caring too much language often masks abuse. Lesson 5. Improve how institutions respond to concerning adult-child friendships. St. Francis Xavier School, where Jenny and Hodgson's daughters attended, apparently had no systems triggering concern about Hodgson's friendship with his daughter's teenage friend. Modern safeguarding practices should include staff training to recognize grooming behaviors, clear policies about parents' interactions with students other than their children, channels for students to report uncomfortable situations, information sharing between schools and law enforcement. Lesson 6. Recognize that predators often appear normal. Hodgson was married, had children, was embedded in his community. He didn't fit stereotypical predator profiles, no known prior convictions, not a stranger lurking in shadows. He was someone's dad, someone's neighbor, someone you might chat with at the pub. Understanding that predators often have normal social facades prevents the "it couldn't be him" denial that sometimes protects abusers. Anyone, regardless of how normal they seem, can be dangerous if their behavior raises red flags. Lesson 7. Support victims leaving dangerous relationships. If Jenny had tried to end the relationship with Hodgson before her death, did she have support systems to do so safely? Leaving controlling relationships is exceptionally dangerous. The point of separation is when violence often escalates. Communities need domestic violence services accessible to young people, safety planning resources, legal protections available quickly, law enforcement taking threats seriously, support networks helping people leave safely. We can't know if Jenny tried to leave or if she viewed her relationship with Robert as a form of leaving David, but providing clear paths to safety for anyone in controlling relationships might prevent some murders. Lesson 8. Believe young people who report inappropriate adult behavior. Sometimes victims tell someone, a friend, a teacher, a relative, about inappropriate adult behavior. They might not frame it as abuse, they might describe it as confusing or uncomfortable. They might test whether the adult will react supportively before fully disclosing. Adults receiving such disclosures should believe the young person, not minimize or dismiss concerns, take action to protect them, report to appropriate authorities, maintain support regardless of the young person's initial reluctance. Jenny Nicholl's story doesn't have an ending because her body remains undiscovered. Her case exists in that terrible limbo between solved and unsolved. We know what happened, we know who did it, but we don't know where she is. This makes her case unusual among major crimes. Most murders reach a definitive conclusion. Body found, cause of death established, killer convicted, victim buried. The criminal justice system processes the case, families grieve and eventually find some form of peace, and the case recedes into history. But cases like Jenny's refuse this neat narrative arc. They remain perpetually open, perpetually unresolved in the most fundamental way. For true crime researchers and journalists, these cases present ethical challenges. How do you tell a story that hasn't ended? How do you balance the public interest in understanding crime and justice against a family's ongoing grief? How do you avoid sensationalizing suffering while honestly depicting the impact of violent crime? I've tried throughout this documentary script to center Jenny's humanity, that she was a person with interests, relationships, dreams, not just a victim in a case file. She played guitar, she loved Jimi Hendrix, she treasured a teddy bear from childhood. She worked at the co-op and lived with her parents and maintained close family ties. David Hodgson took all of that away. He took her life, her future, her presence in her family. And then he took even the basic dignity of burial by hiding her body and refusing forever to reveal where she is. The case also illustrates how violence creates endless ripples. Brian and Ann Nicholl live with absence every day. Jenny's siblings live without their sister. Friends and bandmates from No Fouling remember her frozen at 19, forever young while they've aged. The Richmond community carries the knowledge that this horror occurred in their town. Hodgson's own family lives with the stigma of connection to his crime. And somewhere within perhaps 20 miles of Richmond, Yorkshire, in woodland or hidden in terrain only Hodgson knows, Jenny Nicholl's remains rest undiscovered. Will they ever be found? It's possible, but increasingly unlikely as years pass. Natural processes degrade remains. Landscapes change, memories fade. Even if Hodgson eventually discloses the location, perhaps as he nears death and confronts his own mortality, perhaps as a final act of manipulation seeking attention or benefit, will there be anything left to find after decades? Helen's law now shapes Hodgson's imprisonment. If he seeks parole, the parole board must weigh his refusal to disclose against him. This might keep him imprisoned for life. Or he might eventually be released, deemed no longer dangerous despite his continued silence, and will live out his remaining years as a free man who got away with hiding his victim. Either way, Jenny remains hidden. For those of us who research and tell these stories, there's always the question, what's the point? What good does it do to revisit these tragedies? To examine murders that occurred 20 years ago? To remind families of their worst moments? I believe there are several answers. First, these stories honor victims by refusing to let them be forgotten. Jenny Nicholl deserves to be remembered as more than a missing person file. Her life mattered. Her death represents an injustice that should be recognized. Second, these cases teach us about justice systems, their capabilities and limitations. The Jenny Nicholl case shows both triumph, securing conviction without a body through innovative forensics, and failure, inability to provide closure through recovery of remains. Third, understanding how crimes occur, how investigations unfold, and how prosecutions succeed or fail helps society prevent future tragedies. Every case like Jenny's teaches lessons about grooming, domestic violence, age gap relationships, and controlling behavior. Fourth, these stories sometimes generate new leads. Someone watching or reading might remember something, might come forward, might provide the crucial piece of information that finally brings Jenny home. And fifth, these cases drive legal and social reform. The Jenny Nicholl case contributed to the recognition of forensic linguistics as a discipline. Her family's advocacy helped pass Helen's law. Their suffering, though it cannot be redeemed, can at least contribute to changes that help other families. On June 30th, 2005, 19-year-old Jenny Nicholl left her family home in Richmond, North Yorkshire, telling her mother she'd be staying with friends. She took camping equipment, her silver CD player, and her treasured military dress teddy bear. She drove away in her white Rover 214i. She never came home. The investigation that followed would demonstrate the power of combining traditional detective work with cutting-edge forensic science. Phone records, car hire documents, DNA evidence, and Professor Malcolm Coulthard's pioneering linguistic analysis of text messages proved that David Hodgson, a married father 26 years Jenny's senior who'd been grooming her since she was 14, had killed her and then created fake text messages to make police believe she'd run away to Scotland. In February 2008, after a 5-week trial at Teesside Crown Court, a jury convicted Hodgson of murder based entirely on circumstantial evidence. No body, no eyewitnesses, no crime scene. Just an overwhelming web of evidence from which there was no escape. Justice Openshaw sentenced Hodgson to life imprisonment with an 18-year minimum term, calling him a devious liar who constructed an elaborate web of deceit and showed no remorse. Hodgson has never revealed where he left Jenny's body. He has never admitted guilt. He has never shown the slightest hint of humanity toward Jenny's family. Brian and Ann Nicholl became advocates for Helen's Law, the prisoner's disclosure of information about victims. Act 2020, which requires the parole board to consider a killer's refusal to disclose a victim's location when assessing release. The law came into force in January 2021, meaning Hodgson's continued silence will weigh heavily against any parole application. The case established forensic linguistics as a recognized forensic discipline. Professor Coulthard's work demonstrated that linguistic analysis, when properly conducted and corroborated by physical evidence, can prove authorship of disputed texts beyond reasonable doubt. The Council for the Registration of Forensic Practitioners formally recognized forensic linguistics in September 2008, partly due to this case. North Yorkshire Police continue to treat Jenny's disappearance as an open investigation. Detective Chief Inspector Pete Martin stated in 2015, David Hodgson has never admitted his guilt and has refused to reveal where he left Jenny. He has shown not the slightest hint of remorse or humanity towards Jenny's family. Somewhere in the Richmond area, Jenny Nicholl's remains rest undiscovered. Her parents live without closure. Her family cannot perform the basic human ritual of burial, and David Hodgson, now approximately 65 years old, maintains his silence from prison. This is the Jenny Nicholl case, a murder solved through groundbreaking forensic science, a family denied basic dignity through a killer's cruelty, and a legal legacy that changed how British law treats killers who hide their victims. Jenny was a guitarist with green eyes who loved Jimi Hendrix and treasured a teddy bear in military uniform. She was 19 years old when jealous rage ended her life. She deserved so much more than she got, more years, more music, more life, and she deserves to be found. If anyone has information about Jenny Nicholl's disappearance or knows where her remains might be located, please contact North Yorkshire Police. The investigation remains open. Jenny's family deserves to bring her home. Thank you for listening to Crime Unknown. If you found this documentary valuable, please share it with others who might benefit from understanding Jenny's story. And please remember, if you or someone you know is in a controlling relationship, help is available. You don't have to wait until it becomes dangerous to reach out. This has been the story of Jenny Nicholl, a young woman taken too soon, a killer who refuses to acknowledge what he's done, and a family who continues waiting for their daughter to come home.